Peace, fam. Welcome to the Afri-Culture Concept channel. Today, we're going to be going over part one of how African Americans, enslaved Africans, and free people of color dealt with Native Americans and the 5 civilized tribes of the Midwest and the Southern Indian tribes. I would love to do a part 2, but I need more feedback from my supporters and Afro-cultivators. Also, if you're into learning biblical Hebrew, I am a biblical Hebrew tutor. Get in contact with me on Clubhouse at Ibn Jallo or Guido Bubakar Ibn Jallo. On the 24th of March, I detached Halatuchi Sestinuk Kochakanse and the Negro chief Abraham to General Taylor. They were sent out with messages to the Seminoles west of the Okeechobee and the Havoke and prevailed upon Alligator with blank and 60 Indians and Negroes, of whom 100 were blank to Colonel Smith and General Taylor. J.R. Poinsett, Secretary of War, Washington City, July 6, 1838. After 2 campaigns in the early 1800s to claim Florida, the United States Army finally prevailed. The Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842 cost the United States 1,500 soldiers and spurred one congressman to remark that the black guerrillas were, quote unquote, contending against the whole military power of the United States. The military recognized that delivering black Seminoles, a people well acquainted with freedom, as well as guerrilla warfare, to be captured and sent to a southern plantation would be folly. Instead, in exchange for their freedom, more than 500 agreed to move to Indian Territory where their Seminole neighbors. By the end of 1816, the Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Creeks had already ceded millions of acres of their Mississippi lands to the United States. Here is a map of Choctaw and Chickasaw territory in Mississippi. It is an Anthony Finley map of Mississippi of 1824, courtesy of Mississippi Department of Archers in History. The histories of chattel slavery and Indian removal overlap and intersect in complex and uncomfortable ways. They are not simply parallel or even competing narratives, but are intertwined histories of destruction and dislocation. The expulsion of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Creek nations opened the way for the rapid territorial and economic expansion of plantation slavery into the Deep South. Through the 1830s, the land that had once been Indian country quickly became the United States, quote-unquote, Kingdom of Cotton, as white slaveholders and African slaves flooded the region. From the 1830s until the Civil War, hundreds of thousands of enslaved African Americans were sold from the Upper South to work and die on the mostly white-owned plantation labor camps that covered former Indian towns and hunting grounds. Still, the image of post-removal Deep South as exclusively white and black is misleading because some Native people remained even after removal. For example, Greenwood LeFleur, one of the signers of the Choctaw Removal Treaty, elected to remain in Mississippi, where he eventually owned some 15,000 acres of land and 400 slaves. In 1833, after large numbers of Choctaws had already removed from Mississippi, Samuel Garland remained in Mississippi and intended to remain as long as I can raise one ear of corn. This picture is the Malmaison, Mississippi plantation home of Choctaw Greenwood LeFleur, Malmaison, Carrollton, Carroll County. From the Library of Congress, Prints and Photographs Division, Washington, D.C. Once in the possession of Choctaw and Chickasaw owners, enslaved women, men, and children, some of the many thousands gone, soon found themselves embarking on another journey of dislocation, Indian removal. As a federally driven project executed by military personnel, Indian removal generated letters, reports, and consensuses that enumerated the human and financial cost of forced relocation. Records intended to account for the movement of Indians and their property also unmistakably reveal the presence of the black people owned as property by Choctaw and Chickasaw slaveholders. Rather than traveling under the direction of the United States military, Peter Pitch Lynn led members of his family and 45 of the black people they owned from Mississippi to Indian Territory in 1832. Another independent party of Choctaw immigrants included 11 enslaved people. Chickasaw George Colbert, too, left Mississippi at his own expense, leading a party of Chickasaws, race, gender, and power in the Deep South, including their slaves to the west. Pittsman Colbert also guided a party of Indians and slaves west to Dokesville in the spring of 1838. Over the next two years, hundreds more enslaved people left Mississippi and Alabama with their Choctaw and Chickasaw owners to resettle in the new Chickasaw Nation. In 1842, Chickasaw Removal Party, for example, consisted of 138 slaves and 50 Chickasaws. In 1844, Removal Party included 138 Chickasaws and 56 slaves. Jack Campbell remembered that his mother, quote unquote, belonged to an Indian and was moved from Alabama to the Choctaw Nation. Enslaved in the original Native American territories, their status had not changed much after forced migration to what is now the state of Oklahoma. Well, after settling in these new lands, at that time given the term quote-unquote Indian Territory, their Native American forced labor foremen not only faced the challenge of dealing with African captives that were literate, which could give them the ability to possibly manipulate their power, but the ongoing competition of missionaries that the local natives thought to be administrators of the state to establish economic supremacy and influence of the U.S. government over the Native American presence in the region as well. As quoted again from Black Slaves, Indian Masters, you will read that the Choctaw and Chickasaw slaveholders harbored a persistent distrust of the missionaries, especially because of their anti-slavery stance, and never ignored the issues of time, mobility, and independence that arose when enslaved people went to mission churches. In 1836, shortly after the Choctaws and Chickasaws had left Mississippi for Indian Territory, Choctaw lawmakers governing both the Choctaw and Chickasaw peoples prohibited teaching slaves to read, to write, or to sing in meeting houses or schools or in any open place without their master's permission. Subsequent laws restricted enslaved people's possession of horses in an effort to hinder them from attending mission church services. Cherokee and Creek lawmakers enacted similar legislation around the same time, ostensibly reining in missionaries, but really clamping down on enslaved African Americans. Slaveholders exaggerated the threat that missionaries might launch an abolitionist assault in Indian country and often missed the ways in which enslaved people directed missionaries' anti-slavery sentiment to their own benefit. Over Christianity, colonialism, and slavery, the years, a number of enslaved people owned by Indians were hired to work at the missions, and some of them successfully liberated themselves by convincing the missionaries to purchase their freedom. In both the Indian nations and the United States, lawmakers strengthened the institution of slavery by intensifying the association of blackness and servitude, severely constraining the rights and protections extended to black people. Despite Indian lawmakers' determined measures to rid Choctaw and Chickasaw territory of free black people, laws were applied unevenly, and some free black people remained in the nations apparently undisturbed. When the 1840 expulsion law was approved, in fact, Lawmakers immediately exempted two men, William Black and Louis Durant, from its provisions. In 1860, census takers from Arkansas crossed into Indian Territory and enumerated the non-native inhabitants in the Indian nations. Of the 57 non-native households identified in the Chickasaw Nation, 3 were composed of free black people. In the Choctaw Nation, free black men and women headed just 13 of the 270 non-native households and were also included in 4 additional households headed by white residents. The 76 free people of color in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations in the 1860 census made up slightly less than 10% of the free non-native population. Living in a slave country bordered by the slave states, Texas and Arkansas, free black people in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations faced the very real threat of kidnapping and sale by both Indians and white Americans. In one widely known case that dragged on from the 1830s to 1856, white slaveholders and speculators conspired to seize and sell members of the free black Beams family. In another case from the mid-1840s, Choctaw light horsemen arrested a free black woman and her children at the urging of a Chickasaw woman and her white husband, who hoped to enslave them. The court ruled that the family was free, and the chief of the district where they lived ordered them to comply with the law and leave the nation. On the morning of July 17, 1863, approximately 9,000 soldiers gathered at Honey Springs near Rentisville in what would be the bloodiest Civil War battle fought in Indian Territory. History would also remember them for another reason. The majority of men who fought that day, for both the North and the South, were either African American or Native American. The year before, in October of 1862, the abolitionist Senator James Lane called upon the freedmen and escaped Africans from Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Texas to form the first Kansas Colored Volunteer Infantry, the first black regiment in the Union Army. In its first battle on October 29th, the Volunteer Regiment proved its honor beyond a shadow of a doubt. 225 African soldiers defeated 500 Confederates at the battle at Island Mound in Bates County, Missouri. By August 1860, enslaved people from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana fled their owners and arrived in the Choctaw Nation, suggesting the expansive networks of communication that linked slaves in Indian Territory to their fellow slaves in neighboring states. Word had spread outward from the Choctaw Nation that it would soon be free territory. The 1866 treaties between the United States and the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations were the last of their kind. In the spring and summer of 1866, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations agreed to the final terms of their respective treaties with the United States. The treaties confirmed the abolition of slavery and laid out the terms of black people's citizenship in each nation. Yet the treaties did not present a unified course of action for the nation's leaders or former slaves. Rather, each treaty mapped a different route of black citizenship. The Seminoles Treaty granted, quote unquote, persons of African descent and blood and their descendants all the rights of native citizens. The Cherokee Treaty confirmed, quote unquote, all the rights of native Cherokees upon ex-slaves and their descendants, but also required that refugee freed people return to the nation within 6 months to secure their citizenship. The Creek leaders signed a treaty that allowed former slaves up to 1 year to return to that nation, and it extended, quote unquote, all the rights and privileges of native citizens, including an equal interest in the soil and national funds, to former slaves and their descendants. Only freedmen in the Seminole Nation seemed unimpeded in the enjoyment of their rights as citizens in the years after the Civil War. The Choctaw and Chickasaw Treaty also addressed the matter of free people's citizenship and right of return, but set forth a stunningly convoluted set of provisions that in retrospect could only result in confusion and turmoil. The Choctaw-Chickasaw 1866 Treaty, like the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole 1866 treaties, expanded on the laws and ideals governing Reconstruction in the southern states. But the Choctaw-Chickasaw Treaty most firmly linked the issue of black people's citizenship in these Indian nations to federal policies designed to undercut Indian land holdings and tribal sovereignty. The treaty language thus extended Congress's reach past the geopolitical boundaries of the states and added spectacularly new elements of Reconstruction's promotion of a strong national government, free labor ideology, and protection of black people's civil rights. In language that echoed the recently approved 13th Amendment, the second article of the Choctaw-Chickasaw Treaty required the nations to abolish slavery and involuntary servitude. Choctaw delegates did not obtain the financial compensation for abolition they had desired. Other sections proposed the creation of a unified government of Indian Territory composed of delegates from each nation or tribe, and also called upon the Choctaws and Chickasaws to quote-unquote agree to such legislation as Congress and the President of the United States may deem necessary for the better administration of justice and the protection of the rights of person and property within the Indian Territory. The treaty sections that dealt with black people's freedom addressed these issues as discrete matters, but wove them together, effectively linking freedom and land as fungibles under the terms of their 1866 treaty. The Choctaw and Chickasaw nations ceded around 4.6 million acres of land, known as the quote-unquote leased district, to the United States in exchange for $300,000. The treaty allowed the federal government to retain control of the money until the Choctaw and Chickasaw lawmakers enacted quote-unquote laws, rules, and regulations needed to quote-unquote grant all persons of African descent and their descendants, quote-unquote, all rights, privileges, and immunities, including the right of suffrage of citizens, except in the annuities, monies, and public domain claimed by or belonging to said nations respectively. Eligibility for citizenship was limited to those black people who were, quote-unquote, resident in the nations in September 1865 when the Fort Smith Council convened. Unlike the Cherokee and Creek treaties, the Choctaw/Chickasaw Treaty did not allow a window of time for black war refugees to return to the nations. The treaty's fourth article elaborated on the subject of freed people's rights and reiterated the call for Indian and black equality under the law. Black people were to be recognized as quote-unquote competent witnesses in all civil and criminal suits in proceeding in the Choctaw and Chickasaw courts. In keeping the United States ideals of free labor, Indian employers were expected to enter quote-unquote reasonable and equitable contracts with freed people, providing quote-unquote fair remuneration for their labor. Lastly, black people like Indians, were to have unrestricted access to the nations, land commons to build their own homes and farms. According to the Treaty of the United States, they would pay out $300,000 only if the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations legally recognized black people's citizenship within 2 years by 1868. 3/4 of the money would be paid to the Choctaw Nation and 1/4 to the Chickasaw Nation, the proportions reflecting the relative size of their populations. The final amount dispersed, however, was to be reduced by $100 for every former slave who voluntarily immigrated to the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations within 90 days of the citizenship legislation's enactment. The treaty also included a contingency plan regarding black people's citizenship. If the nations failed to grant full citizenship to former slaves by June 1868, the federal government would no longer hold the $300,000 in trust for the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. Instead, the United States would retain the funds for quote-unquote use and benefit of the former slaves in the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations. If the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations did not recognize black people as equal citizens by 1868 in June, the United States agreed that within 90 days, the federal government would remove, quote-unquote, all such persons of African descent as may be willing to remove. Black people who opted to remain in the Choctaw Chickasaw nations forfeited their claims to a share of the $300,000 and would be subject to the same laws, quote unquote, as other citizens of the United States in the said nations. The treaty further compounded the issues of black people's citizenship and Indian nations' land claims in sections that proposed the survey and allotment of the Choctaw and Chickasaw lands. In these nations, as in the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations, custom and law had long recognized the people's collective ownership of the land. Even as the communal town fields of the late 18th century gave way to individual family farms, pastures, and plantations bounded by rough-hewn worm fences, individuals still owned only their improvements, livestock, and slaves, but not the land. The Treaty of 1866 signaled Americans' growing impatience with Indian nations, collective land title, and shoved them in the direction of private land ownership. Warming up for the mandatory allotment policies of the late 1880s, the Treaty of 1866 placed the matter in the hands of Choctaw and Chickasaw legislators, leaving them to accept or reject the survey and allotment of their land in 160-acre parcels. If the Choctaw and Chickasaw governments agreed to this allotment scheme, land distribution would follow a racial grid that distinguished between Negroes and Indians and limited black people to only 40-acre allotments. By the late summer of 1870, Agent Olmsted reported that black people's unresolved citizenship status had not deterred them from, quote-unquote, laboring for themselves and families. In the early 1870s, Lyman Butler indicated that many free people in the Choctaw Nation chose their own homes and improved, quote-unquote, such qualities of land as we think we can cultivate. By 1930, members of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations held less than 2 million acres of land, compared to the 1890 total of nearly 20 million acres. Black people's acquisition of land allotments under federal law had a number of paradoxical implications. Here is a picture of Ann Mickle and B.F. Kemp's former slave in a buggy. Chickasaw County or Chickasaw Council House Collection, courtesy of Oklahoma Historical Society. Here is a picture of a former enslaved African American, which we would call a freedman, Ed Bailey, a slave of Robert M. Jones from the Choctaw Nation. The Robert L. Williams Collection, courtesy of the Oklahoma Historical Society. This is a picture of Chickasaw freedmen filing for allotments. Tishomingo, Oklahoma, I.T.W.P. Campbell Collection, courtesy of Oklahoma Historical Society. Okay, fam. That will be the end of part 1. Part 2 will be coming up next. But I need at least 10 comments and 10 follows before I drop part 2. I need a little more feedback because I want to know what you guys know. And I also want to know what else you guys want to go over and what else do you guys want to see. By the way, my Clubhouse link will be in the description below. Go to my Clubhouse. Follow me. Guido Boubacar Ibn Jallo. Peace.